He pressed his palm to the cheap plywood of the supply closet door because the world outside had teeth, because boots on gravel sounded like a countdown, and because the only thing between a 7-year-old who believed his father could fix anything and a bullet was his ability to keep breathing. Leela's hair smelled like cheap perfume and engine oil, and she was trembling so hard her fingers left flower-white prints on the back of his neck. He had pulled her inside by the collar of a leather jacket that cost more than his toolbox. The zipper had snagged against his knuckles. For one impossible breath, the two of them were a rumor in a place where rumors were dangerous. A filthy janitor's closet, fluorescent light buzzing. The world beyond, a roar of bikes and shouting, and something heavier, metallic, inevitable, coming through the compound gates. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds. If this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. He kissed her because there was no time to invent anything else. He kissed her and put his whole life into that motion, the tiredness, the promise to Anna that their boy wouldn't know the road the way she'd known it, the 1,000 small lies he told himself to keep them safe. It was a practiced, blunt thing, and also a confession. I will do anything to keep you quiet, even if that anything is ridiculous. Leela froze at first, like a deer with a headlight in its ribs, then answered with a tremor that was more fear than consent, because the air in that tiny room had become a bargaining table, and they were both selling something they couldn't afford to lose. The closet smelled of lemon cleaner and motor oil, a scent that for Marco had become the background of his days. He cupped her face with hands that had held baby bottles and grease rags, and for a moment he forgot to be invisible. Her skin was warm and soft, startlingly human beneath the moonlight that fell in a strip through the slatted window, and he tasted a wine he could not afford and a lie he hoped they'd believe. Outside, the shouted names of the Blackthorn's patch holders ricocheted off corrugated metal. The wrong club had come calling for the wrong woman. He could hear the slide of a magazine being tucked into place, one breath a meter from the closet door. He pulled his mouth away, whispered, "Play it," and she nodded, eyes blown wide, because a life spent wearing armor doesn't teach you how to pretend you're vulnerable. The moment tugged like an anchor. Leela Hargrove, the heiress, the woman who wore a Hargrove ring like a gauntlet, could have walked out and blown his whole life apart with a single sentence. She could have lifted the lid on the delicate balance he'd engineered since Anna's funeral. Morning shifts cleaning the clubhouse, nights at a paint shop, a steady bed for his son Mateo, homework done, the truth smoothed into the two of them like plaster. Instead, she let the lie thrum between them. "Say it," he mouthed. She repeated, slower, voice scraping. "Marco, we're—" She swallowed, then managed, "We're together." The closet became a coffin for a secret they hadn't agreed upon. The truth of who he was lodged itself as stubbornly as a hairline crack in concrete. Marco Ruiz was not a thorn. He'd come north from San Antonio with a battered Ford and a toolbox and a memory of roads that smelled like rain and cigarettes. He washed the Blackthorn's grease from their boots and wiped the sauce from their ribs. He was the man who emptied ashtrays and folded the veils of the long table when the club hosted charity poker nights. He had a son who drew superheroes on the margins of school letters and called his father a hero because Marco had promised and had kept that he would be. The Thorns' colors meant nothing to him. His colors were the faded Star Wars t-shirt under his uniform and the smell of coffee in the mornings. That anonymity was currency. That anonymity was safety. He'd made a life out of being unseen. Leela Hargrove was everything that could fracture that life. She carried leather gloves and a natural authority that rendered men silent. The name Hargrove came with a ledger of expectations. Alliances, violence, inheritances that read like land deeds with bullets for margins. She'd been reared on satin and the roar of the family dinner table when contracts were negotiated like farm animal sales. The Iron Hells were not myth. They were a dynasty of iron and oath, a sister club tied by marriage and blood to the thorny men who now filled the clubhouse like a swarm. Nobody was supposed to see Leela without an entourage or without a laughing, dangerous crowd behind her. She was supposed to be shielded, armored, impassive in the face of threats. Seeing her in his arms, hair tangled with soot, breathing like a tiny animal, rearranged the rules. The raiders outside, an angry spray of a rival club that had misread an alley of loyalties, assumed they found an Hargrove planted in enemy territory. The Blackthorn's fastness at the edge of town was both a sanctuary and a stage. To cross its threshold was to step into a world of rules that didn't tolerate ambiguity. If the Iron Hells saw their heiress in a supply closet with a man who didn't wear colors, questions would bloom like fungus. Was she gathering intelligence? Was she a mole? Or worse, was she being courted by a janitor's loyalty? The worst kind of suspicion. In those syndicates, appearances were the first line of evidence and the last line of mercy. Marco had sacrificed a lot to keep Matteo safe. He'd traded his prospects, more literally, his past, when he left the club life. He'd walked away from the Brotherhood's pull because a baby's cry had sounded louder than the engine's promise. But the past is a long stretch of road. It remembers you by the shine on your shoes and the way you carry a wrench. He had kept his head down, but the world had a habit of demanding receipts. He held on to the lie that a janitor could be trusted because he had nothing to gain and everything to lose. "How long?" Leela whispered when the footsteps paused and a muffled voice barked something about colors and a song that none of the men outside liked. He smelled the copper of his own blood in his mouth and the sweat that had been his companion for years. "How long have you been hiding this place?" she asked, and it was a question that asked for more than directions. It wanted a history. It wanted a loyalty certificate affixed to his soul. "Too long," he said. "Long enough to know when trouble's coming." He wanted to be firm. Instead, his voice came out ragged. The closet's light flickered. Her hand came up, testing the back of his neck like she was trying to map him by touch. "You could run," she said quietly. The strangest suggestion, as if she could imagine him lifting Matteo up and walking away from the Blackthorn's chain of obligations. "Take your boy south. Go back to Texas. You don't have to." She stopped because she saw something in him, an old road tired of pretending it could be ignored. He looked at her then, really looked. In the second between one footfall and the next, he catalogued her, the tiny scar by her lip that told a story of a fight she had refused to lose, the chain with a bullet pendant that was more ritual than jewelry, the hands, calloused as a rider's, though manicured for appearances. "I can't," he said. "Not now." His son's face, round-cheeked with a gap where a top tooth would be, floated in his mind like a photograph he needed to keep warm. The promise to Anna, to their son, held him like an oath. "I made a promise." "To your ex-club?" she asked, the word soft with accusation. She was not Hargrove there. She was just Leela, stripped of gallery gowns and public poise. To them? To some ghost of a man who sold you a brotherhood that stole your nights? Marco tightened his jaw against a history he had sealed in rust. "To my wife," he said, "to my son. That's reason enough." He had traded the possibility of runs and patches and prospects for a quieter world, where the loudest sound was a child's laugh. He had mended the things that came apart, stoves, relationship edges, school projects, and in doing so had convinced himself he had paid his dues in full. A noise outsnapped teeth, a curse. A bike revved, low and insistent. Through the metal slats, a silhouette loped across the yard, a shadow hunting. Panic could be a contagion. Marco felt it trying to crawl up his spine. The closet door shivered. Leela began, but their roles reversed. She was no longer Heiress, and he no longer Janitor. He cut her off with a hand at her mouth. Not rudely, but because the truth was a weapon, and he needed it blunted. We play it like we're together. You let them think. He gestured minutely toward himself. That I'm the thing you want outside of the club. That I'm the comfort you found hiding from the world, not the Heiress storm that could start a war. She blinked, incredulous, then laughed under her breath, a short sound split by fear. Marco Ruiz, she said, tasting his name like a coin. You pick the most dangerous lies. Sometimes the dangerous ones are the simplest, he said. He could feel her breath hitch against his palm. He did not know how to ask her for anything more pious than compliance. He did not know how to weigh the cost of the exploit, an exchange of proximity for safety, a rented intimacy that might become more expensive the more it was used. He had a son who could not be dragged into this. He had a promise he would never break. If pretending to be her lover for a few breaths bought them both a mile of safety, he would play the fool. The door handle dipped. A voice outside said, "We close in 5. The clubs had rituals for clearance, for who left and who stayed. If she's Hargrove, we take her to the old lot," another voice said. "We humiliate her, teach the iron hells to keep their women locked up." Laughter. A boot hit the threshold. Marco felt his heart pivot under a steel plate. Lila's fingers dug into his shoulder. Her whisper was a razor. "Promise me you won't let them touch Mateo," she said. He swore then, soft under his breath, saying his son's name like it was a prayer. He would guard that small life with the ferocity of the men outside who could kill for a patch. He had not meant to become brave. Bravery had been thrust onto him with a mother's grave complaint and a child's small hands. But a promise is a rope. It ties you to the dock when the world wants to sweep you out to sea. "Okay," he said. "We'll do this. Pretend. Get them out." He straightened his shoulders and smoothed his shirt with palms that had been steady for years. The fluorescent light hummed. He inhaled Lila's scent once more because it felt like stealing something sacred, and the lie they were crafting hummed with potential danger and improbable mercy. Outside, the club's engines waited like a jury. Inside, the janitor and the heiress arranged themselves to be a story that neither believed, just long enough for the night to pass. They opened the closet like a stage cue. Marco felt it in the way the light shifted, the faint change in pitch when the voices outside got closer, the smell of oil turning subterranean and dangerous. The patch holders at the table wanted spectacle. They wanted to see power reduced to a trembling human. The idea that a Hargrove could be embarrassed in front of Blackthorn's rookies was a currency exchange. One favor could be traded for another. He stepped out first, shoulders hunched as if to swallow any hint of authority he might accidentally possess. Leela followed, the practiced control of a woman who'd spent her life being watched, now tempered with the urgent, raw edge of someone who could genuinely be afraid. They walked as a tableau. Marco, a man whose shirt hung like a story from another life, and Leela, hair mussed, lipstick smudged, the portrait of a woman who'd just been saved by a lie. Heads turned, conversations broke like waves. The men around the poker tables froze and then rewrote whatever script they had in their pockets. The scent of beer and cologne braided in the air. The clubhouse felt suddenly theatrical, as if each lamp and scarred wooden chair were on stand to judge. Whispers slid across the room. Hargrove, Heiress, Janitor. "Put her here," someone ordered, and a plastic chair scraped on concrete. Marco kept his hands visible, palms a neutral white. He had the look of a man whose job was to keep things clean, not to start fights. He could feel Leela's breath at his shoulder, every measured inhale a tiny shudder. When she planted herself in the chair, she gave the room a look that could have been a warning. But the men there were hungry for a show. A woman's wrath can be a less profitable spectacle than a woman's humiliation. They wanted to see a prince unmade. The night unfolded into interrogation in a way Marco had never been trained for. Prospects leaned forward, elbows dusted with grime, asking pointed questions with the carnival cruelty of people who mistook cruelty for strategy. The air itself pressed on Leela, as if heritage could be suffocated under suspicion. They wanted to know why she had crossed into Thorn territory unshielded. They wanted to know whether she had betrayed Iron Hell's secrets for pleasure. They liked the idea of betrayal, because betrayal was something they understood and could map with knives. Leela answered like someone giving currency, words measured coin by coin. She said she had been at a charity in the next town, that a fight had broken out and she had slipped away. That she had been tired of galas, tired of the way her name preceded her and made men decide things about her before she had finished a sentence. That she liked the anonymity of being laughed at in a dive bar sometimes. She spoke with an ease that suggested rehearsed truths and shielded narratives. People listened. Yet the ledger of suspicion is long, and appetite for scandal is insatiable. "You get lost in the cut?" a man in a sleeveless vest asked, voice low and casual, designed to look like brokering a trade. "Or you get tired of the game?" He smiled in that way men do when they're trying to bait a response and then profit from what comes out. Leela gave him a glance that would have cut a man who wasn't drunk on being judged. "Neither," she said, and there was a burn to it that Marco wanted to protect. "I was tired of being told what to want." That would have been enough to stir a wide range of reactions in normal rooms: sympathy, envy, resentment. But in a clubhouse the size of a small town, what it produced was speculation. Some saw it as the arrogance of a woman who believed she could choose how to be used by her family and still keep her name intact. Others considered it treasonous, in the quiet way people treat those who stray from the map. The president of the Black Thorn, a man called Heiress, thick-necked, scarred from a life of proving his toughness, spoke then, his voice a measured thunder. He had the authority to make things end or escalate. "If she's Hargrove," he said, looking at the assembled patchholders like a man reading from an old ledger, "then we can't be the place for her tonight. We hand her over, and this ends." Something in the room flexed. Arguments clipped each other like knives. A prospect with a new cut across his eyebrow argued they couldn't trust Hargroves with territory. Another, older, reminded them of alliances, of old blood, and the way marriages had stitched clubs together. The room became a battleground of small mercies and large calculations. Marco felt like a pebble in a river, being moved by currents whose geography he did not remember learning. Leela's jaw tightened. She looked like a rider who'd been dumped and now had to pick herself up without an audience. "You don't hand me over," she said, and the room became quieter, as if language itself was being held in check. "I am not property. You move when it's convenient." Her voice had a steel that didn't just come from lineage, but from the small rebellions she had engineered. Quiet moves to redirect violence into negotiation, to save lives with words instead of bullets. There was a pause, and in that pause, Marco felt something shift inside him, a slim, dangerous hope. The novelties of the night were making him lightheaded like cheap whiskey. He had never been a man who believed destiny would pull him into its web. He'd built walls against such fantasies. But there, under the roar of engines and the glare of lamps, he tasted the possibility that he could claim some other future, not mapped by the brothers who circled like wolves. The rival club's name surfaced then, some old grievance woven into this night's cruelty. A rumor that Leela's father had pushed for a takeover of territory last year, and lost, a debt unpaid in blood. Old grudges are like rust. They eat into metal until the thing that connected two people becomes brittle. If the Iron Hells thought one of their own had been compromised here, they would not let the slight go unreturned. "Say you made a mistake," the prospect with the eyebrow said, leaning in. "Tell us you're ashamed." "No," Leela said. "I made a choice." Her eyes found Marco then, quick and sharp. There was gratitude there, quick, practical. An acknowledgement that for a minute he had lent her anonymity. But also a question. How far would he go? What had he traded? He had a son, and people with sons behave differently in the face of danger. They count lives like ledger entries. Marco met her gaze and found, to his surprise, that he did not want to look away. The clubhouse felt suddenly like the place where two different kinds of courage could intersect. One that arises from birthright, and one that comes from refusing to bring a child into a life of knives. He wanted to say, "I will not let you drag my Mateo into this." He wanted instead to say, "I will not let you be sacrificed to their hunger." He had no script to say both at the same time. "Order," Reyes said finally, slicing through the tension. "We either handle it quietly, or we make it messy. Hargrove blood is a leverage. We don't give leverage away." They argued around the idea of leverage like men around a table arguing about a debt. Deals were discussed in a way that was reprehensible for Marco and clinical for others. The room had become a marketplace where people traded flesh for favor, where a woman's safety was something to be priced. Leela laughed, a sharp, disbelief hollow noise. "You would sell me like that? Sell me to people who only know how to humiliate what they cannot own?" Her voice trembled with fury, with the exhaustion of a woman who had been owned in 1,000 small ways and still found herself needing to strike to make space. "You asked to be anonymous, girl," someone shot back, poorly disguising a threat as a joke. That moment, when someone dismissed her plea as an invitation, flamed something in Marco he didn't know he had. He remembered Anna's hand on his arm, the way she'd looked at him when she believed he could make a life with less fear. He remembered Mateo's small face pressed to his throat when thunder moved through the sky and the boy was afraid. He had promised. He had not promised to be unflinching. He'd promised to be there. "She stays," he said, louder than he meant to. Heads turned. He felt the weight of his own voice like a strange gift, something he'd practiced for and kept packed away. "You don't make a move that'll drag a kid into this hole. You don't make decisions that'll paint the rest of us with your mistakes." Silence carved itself like a new road through the clubhouse. The air went thin. Men looked at him, measuring whether a janitor had the cojones to declare their moral boundaries. Lila's eyes widened. She hadn't expected him to speak. A rumor of a smile flickered across her face, a brief recognition that maybe, in this one stupid, dangerous night, she had found an ally in the most unlikely coat. "That your son?" Reyes asked, and the question was less a conversation than a weighing scale. Revealing a child's existence in a world that thrives on secrecy was like putting a match to oil. Men with nothing to lose love to play with other people's stakes. "Yes," Marco said. The word was small but heavy as an anvil. He felt suddenly naked, not because he had spoken the truth, but because he had named what he was defending. The room rearranged itself again, now framed by the fact that a life, small and innocent, might be the price for their entertainment. A few men nodded with a hard, private respect. Others looked at him with thinly veiled contempt, as if his honest stake made him weak. Reyes took a long drag of his cigarette, then crushed it into the ashtray like he was imprinting the whole night into permanence. "All right," he said, "we do this clean. She goes to the lot. We make a point." His voice promised a whole world of decisions to be made between now and dawn. "You keep your kid out of it." "I will," Marco said. It was a vow and a demand, the kind that in their world were only as strong as the backs that held them. He felt naked and brave and foolish at once. People in this place measured men by what they would lose before they would let it be taken. Marco had a small life that wasn't meant for this, yet here he stood, offering it as reason to think. Leela's hand brushed his, then held it hard. For a sliver of a moment, they were not Heiress and Janitor. They were two people who had been pulled from their boundaries and found themselves side by side. The moment didn't erase years of difference, but it folded them together in a way that made something like possibility hum between their palms. "Promise me," she said, low, near to his ear, "that you won't come running if they come for me, that you'll stand with Matteo and not chase ghosts." "I promise," he said, but the word felt inadequate. He pictured his boy's face and wanted to carve it into stone. He wanted to be a wall they couldn't breach. "I'll be here." "Good," she said, and let his hand go, but not the kind of letting go that is final. It was a temporary release, like a rider stepping back from the edge of a war he's trained against. They arranged the terms like concessionaires, trading safety for dignity and minutes for truth. Leela agreed to be taken to the lot. The public humiliation she refused to call defeat would be strategic. Marco would keep Matteo out of the compounds and the crosses of manhood that could scar a child forever. The bargain had the texture of something that could go wrong, and likely would. But under oppressive skies, bargains are life rafts. When the club's men walked Leela toward the lot, Marco followed at a distance that felt both cowardly and necessary. The engines lit up like a border crossing. The cold air smacked them awake. Leela glanced back once, meeting Marco's eyes with a look that held gratitude and warning. And then she was led away like cargo no one had offered to carry, but everyone had an opinion on. The lot smelled of oil and asphalt and damp memory. Under the glare of flood lamps, Leela stood before men whose faces knew how to turn other people's houses into battlefields. They spoke in sharp syllables of power and consequence. Marco watched from the edge because standing too close meant being swept into the current, but standing too far meant losing the shape of what you were protecting. His son was sleeping in a neighbor's trailer, tucked in with a woman who owed him a favor. Every honk of a bike gouged a notch into his chest. The night stretched like a tightrope. Marco walked it in the dark, palms empty and full. He had started the evening thinking he could keep himself and his boy invisible forever, but the world had a way of disobeying plans. Lila Hargrove had kissed him in a closet and then been carried into a storm. Now what was left between them was more dangerous than the lie they'd invented in panic. It was a promise that neither of them had the right to keep, but both could not let go of. He had said he would not run. He had sworn to stand. The difference between the two is where men either die quietly or become part of a story worth telling. Marco did not know yet which he would be. But as he stood under the lot's harsh light, watching a woman born into iron prepare to face tempest, he felt the gears in his life shift. There would be questions to answer after tonight, secrets that would scrape and demand blood. He would have to dig out parts of his past he had kept buried under oil towels and baby blankets. Loyalties would be tested. The thorn would ask for purpose, and Hargrove would demand restitution. And somewhere inside him, an ember he had convinced himself was nothing more than leftover heat from old roads began to glow with a dangerous, beautiful possibility. That maybe, in the wreckage of other people's wars, two people could build something that might one day keep a child warm. The engines revved. The night got louder. Marco straightened his shoulders and took a step forward into the kind of trouble that refused to dissolve no matter how much you swept it under the rug. The lot's floodlights bleached the night into harsh paper. Shadows cut like truth. Lila stood with her chin up, the Hargrove ring like a challenge on her hand, and when the Iron Hell's emissary, thick voice, slow smile, stepped forward to speak, Marco felt every muscle in his body prepare for impact. He had not expected diplomacy to smell like gasoline and old leather. Nor had he expected the way being watched would turn his skin raw. "You're making a spectacle of yourself, Reyes," the emissary said, voice low enough to carry menace and history. "Hargrove sends their little heiress out on a whim, or is this some Thorn joke?" Reyes' laugh was short. "Not a joke," he said. "This is complicated." He glanced at Marco, like a man checking whether a plank might snap underfoot. "We take her, we keep this clean. No blood, no public scandal. Hargrove will owe a favor, one we can call in when it matters." The words hollowed out the air. Lila's jaw tightened as if to grind the deal into dust. "You call that keeping it clean?" she asked. There was contempt in it, but also a weary calculation. She knew men like these. What they called clean was a ledger entry, a favor logged and exploited later. Reyes looked at Marco again, and this time his eyes were not just weighing, but cataloging. He'd seen the way Marco had spoken for his son, had felt the backbone that said, "Do not bring a child into this for sport." It irked him, because the Thorns world was measured in scars and debts rather than promises. "And you?" he asked. "What's your stake in this, Janitor?" The question landed like a stone. Marco swallowed. He could have lied, said he was an old friend, a distant cousin, a man with a complexity beyond the patch. Instead, he said what he had said in the clubhouse, because the sound of his own voice had fossilized into a kind of truth. "My son," he said. "He's sleeping tonight. I don't want him here." There was a staccato of laughter, some amused, some scornful, until it curdled into something else, a prickling worry. Men with nothing to lose find the presence of a child's life complicating and therefore obscene. The emissary's smile died. "A child," he said. "You have a child and you work for us? That's anachronistic." Lila's face softened the smallest degree. She had not known Marco's boy would be the lever that could swing a room toward mercy, and yet mercy in this world is a precarious thing, spent like currency. "He won't see this," she said. "We won't let him." "That's not the point," Reyes said. "Nothing about you is free, Ruiz. If you bind yourself to Hargrove now, even in this foolish way, we need to know where your loyalties lie." "I haven't any patch to wear," Marco said. "I have a job and a son and a promise. That's my loyalty." He felt the words like an oath. Saying them aloud made them heavier, harder to dismiss. He could feel the room rearrange itself around that weight. Some men nodded, respect in a way that did not soften them. Others shifted, eyes slitted, as if they had found a new mark to measure. "It'll get worse if you keep this up," the emissary warned. "If Hargrove starts playing at being free, the families will make an example. It's not about you, it's about precedent." Lila laughed then, bitter. "Make an example out of me. Fine. Make an example out of a woman who never asked for this ownership. But you will not make an example out of a child. Not on my watch." Her voice cracked with something close to fury, and for a breath, the Iron Hell's representative registered the impossible reality that Lila could be both heiress and a woman who could still outride their appetite for control. The emissary's jaw clenched. "You think you're the one making choices here?" he asked. "You think because you've tired of being dressed in velvet, you can step into chaos and come out unscathed?" "No," she said simply. "I don't think that. I know I'm not invincible. That's why I planned what I did. I came here to be seen as a person, not a weapon." She stared at Reyes, then at the Thorn prospects. "Is that a crime?" It was a question that landed in the middle of a room of men who'd been taught to turn people into property, into bargaining chips. Silence rolled like a tide. The emissary found his voice again, low and dangerous. "You'll come with us," he said. "If the Iron Hells want something of you, we'll deliver. But know this, If you try to wreck a marriage between clubs, we're not giving you sanctuary. You're speaking like a man who never had to answer to a child, Marco said, and his tone held a clipped edge. The emissary smiled, not with warmth, but with contempt. We don't make decisions based on children, he said. This is club business. That isn't business, Marco said. It's cruelty. He felt the words like a dent into his ribs. He had not vocalized the moral divide between these men and himself before, not out loud. It made something in him raw, but also clear. He had traded the roar of engines for the small domestic sanctities of bath time and homework and laughter. He had not given them up for moral clarity. He'd done it for love. But on nights like this, moral clarity felt like armor he had not planned to wear in the open. Rhea's anger was a tide. If you pick a side, I pick my son, Marco cut in. Always. It was the simplest sentence he'd ever spoken in front of so many men. The implication was a threat of a different kind, that he would not shift his child's life into the territory of men's wars for their amusement. For someone like Heiress, who measured strength in contributions to the chapter's ledger, that was either weakness or an unknown variable that suggested unpredictability. Both made him uneasy. Lila's eyes found Marco then, fast, grateful, wounded. You didn't have to do that, she said. Tell them, put yourself at risk. I didn't have a choice, he said. You were there. Matteo was sleeping. The reality of it felt luminous and absurd. He had hidden a woman born in a castle of violence in a cupboard and then declared his son's safety as a boundary to men who would normally treat children as collateral. The emissary sighed, as if the theater had become too messy for his liking. Fine, he said. We take her to the lot. We make it humiliating enough that Hargrove thinks twice. No blood, we leave at dawn. He looked at Heiress and then at the assembly of men who had been eager for spectacle. And Ruiz, keep your boy away from here. We don't need trouble from men who tie their children's name to their ego. Marco nodded, a nod that felt like a brittle glass. He won't be here. Good. The emissary moved to take Lila, and Marco bristled with protectiveness that surprised him. He had not imagined feeling possessive over someone who could destroy him with one sentence. The complication of the feeling made him dizzy. They pushed her to the center of the lot under the floodlights and then, like a showman who had weighed his crowd, propped up their choreography. Words were lobbed like knives and softened with the pretense of jest. Someone placed a bottle at Lila's feet with a show of mockery. Someone else called out things meant to sting like outdated sermons. Lila stood there, dignified and defiant and tired, and Marco's chest ached with the urge to demolish each man who thought it a sport to humiliate another human being. One of the prospects, calloused knuckles, a scar across one eyebrow, took a step closer, pretending to offer lace or mercy. You always ran with their skirts? He asked, to be cruel. Lila's reply was a quiet thing, but it hit like a stone thrown at glass. I've run with people who didn't ask permission to live the life they wanted, she said. I will not beg a room full of men to let me be human. The words reframed the lot. Where men had expected groveling, she offered dignity. It didn't change their appetite for leverage, but it altered the tone. Some men growled, some looked away. A few shifted, understanding, dangerous in their world because it suggested limits. Marco felt his resolve harden. He had promised. He had always promised before, but had promised to small things, bedtime stories and worn cereal. Now his promise felt expansive and costly. It had given the emissary a dent in their plan by demanding the child's safety be the outer boundary. It had also made Marco visible in a way that could not be undone. The Thorn and the Hargrove would both catalog this night. Stories would be told, and at the center of them would be a janitor who had kissed an heiress in a supply closet and chosen his son's name as a shield. When they finally shoved Leela into a car bound for the old lot, the engines a low chord of menace, she looked at Marco as if offering a quiet benediction. "Stay ready," she said. "This won't be the end." "I know," he said. The knowledge carried premonition like a scent. He watched as the taillights vanished into the night, carrying her away like someone trying to smother a live coal. The lot emptied into an aftertaste of insults and clinks of bottles. Men drifted back to the clubhouse, words already forming that would be used like barbs and balance sheets. Reyes stayed a moment, watching Marco's retreating back. He studied the janitor the way a man studies a map he doesn't entirely trust. "You did well," Reyes said finally, "but there was no warmth in it. You put a boundary where none existed. It was praise and warning braided together." "I did what needed doing," Marco said. The words were flint. "Because a kid shouldn't have to pay for our history." Reyes considered him, the lines around his eyes folding into a map of hard-earned suspicion. "We all have pasts," Reyes said slowly. "Some choose the road back. Others find ways to hide. If Hargrove learns you lied for her, you'll be in their ledger." "I know," Marco answered. He felt the truth slide into him like cold water, clear and horrible. "Then we'll deal with that if it comes. Tonight, I keep Mateo safe." Reyes nodded, as if that settled something. But Marco had the sense that things were far from settled. The lot had shifted the balance in ways that would not be contained by a simple promise of no blood. Old debts, old grudges, and the ledger of families had teeth. Lila's absence left a vacuum that every man there would contest, and Marco's new visibility marked a line in the sand that both clubs would note. He walked back to the clubhouse under the thin wash of street lamps. The night had changed him by degrees, by the kiss in the closet, by the words he'd chosen to say aloud, by the promise he'd made for a sleeping boy. He had wanted, in some private algebra, to keep his son invisible and the world unknown. But life had a way of bringing the map to your doorstep and demanding to be read. He'd put his name in the margins tonight. Someone, somewhere, would underline it. Inside the clubhouse, the smell of coffee and stale beer and sweat waited. Men lounged like lords in waiting for a verdict that might never come. Marco moved through them and felt like an outsider again, but not the kind who could go back to being invisible. He carried a new weight. Secrets were out now, and fractures had begun to show. The way a city's fault lines reveal themselves in quake aftershock. Loyalties would be tested, alliances renegotiated, and truths unearthed that some would rather keep buried. He poured himself a cup of coffee, hands steady, though his pulse still sounded like a motor. Mateo's face flickered in his mind like a lantern. He had protected that small light tonight. He had also aligned himself with a woman whose world could swallow them both if their choices proved too costly. The night had not ended the way he imagined. It had started an argument with fate that he could not yet win. Outside, the night rolled on like a drumbeat. The engines had quieted, but the aftersound lingered in the air like a promise of more. Marco sat, cup cooling in his hands, feeling the weight of the secrets that had been pried open. He did not yet know how many of those secrets would turn knives toward him, or who would stand when the dust settled. He only knew one thing with a clarity that felt like a blade. Nothing would be the same again. The engine's aftershock settled into the bones of the clubhouse like an accusation. Marco felt it there, low and insistent. He finished his coffee with hands that trembled just enough to make the cup clink. It wasn't fear of pain that kept him awake, he had known pain, but the brittle, constant fear of losing what had been given him. Mateo's small mouth against his shoulder, Anna's toothbrush in the cup by the sink, the ordinary rituals he'd rebuilt around a promise. Tonight had loosened something in the world, and in its loosening, Leela had become a presence neither of them could afford. He found himself wandering the compound, not with the intent to eavesdrop, but because standing still invited thinking, and thinking unspooled into worst-case scenarios. The moon scoured the gravel with pale light. A few prospects hunched around a dying fire, trading stories with knives tucked into boots. Heiress watched them like a man who knew he could not control everything, but still needed to count his assets. The lot's events would be picked apart until dawn and stitched into reputations that decided futures. Marco wasn't part of that ledger, but now his name had been written in it in ink that didn't fade. The call came at 2 in the morning, the number Heiress had given him when he left, the one a man uses when he wants a favor honored. A curt voice instructed him to bring Mateo to the back shed at dawn. "Be ready," Heiress said. "If you want your boy safe, follow orders tonight." Marco's gut clenched. The instruction was thinly veiled, like a line of bait. Obey, and you keep what matters. Don't, and the ledger becomes your children's. He could have argued, he could have lied. He thought of Mateo's sleep-tossed hair, the way the boy's fingers tugged at Marco's shirt when nightmares came. He thought, too, of Lila, led into humiliation because a man bent a ledger to his ends. The world was asking Marco to choose, again, and he had already chosen once tonight. Choosing for the second time would demand more. Dawn was a feral thing, claws of pink and gray scraping at the horizon. Marco slipped into the shed where Heiress had asked him, and found a man he thought invincible, already human-sized, the president's shoulders narrower without the clubhouse crowd. Heiress didn't speak at once. He handed Marco a cigarette, and then, without lighting it, met his eyes like a man who measures other men's futures in the set of their jaw. "We're moving," Heiress said. "Hargrove's got a team inbound to collect. They'll be aggressive. The lot's supposed to teach a lesson, but now things are escalating." He paused, as if weighing whether to include Marco in the calculus. "You want to keep your boy a boy and not a bargaining chip tonight." Marco's answer came without pretense. "Yes," he said. "I'll do what you need me to do." Heiress's nod was a shape between gratitude and threat. "You stay visible. People keep track. We don't want him in the crosshair." The order was mercenary mercy. Keep the child out. Keep your head down. Let grown men settle their debts. But when Heiress added, "And if Hargrove's people try to take her by force, we won't let them make martyrs of our house," the words held a promise and a hinge of risk. Marco felt it. He had tasted the bitterness of bargains made by men whose idea of honor was a ledger. Still, Heiress had not told him to hide. He'd told him to stand where eyes could see him, where being a father mattered. When the convoy arrived hours later, the air tightened. Motorcycles cut through the morning with a sound like a wound reopening. Hargrove emissaries dismounted with the casual brutality of people accustomed to getting what they wanted. They swept the lot like judges in leather. Leela was there, flanked by men who bore her name in their scowls. She stood straighter than before, but Marco could see the night had taken its tally in the angle of her shoulders. The two groups glared like predators who'd met at an old bloodline. Words were exchanged first, sharp, contractual things that hinted at alliances and debts, at families settling scores with other families' children, as if a ledger could account for the living. Then someone moved wrong. A prospect lunged for a hand that wasn't there. A Hargrove man pulled a knife with the casual cruelty of a man who'd practiced escalation like breathing. Chaos rippled. It came not as a single explosion, but like a net of small violence. A shove, a bottle thrown, a chain caught on a jacket. Sparks that could become an inferno flared. Men shouted names, the names of old debts, of nights when favors went unpaid, of promises that had been traded for power. Marco felt the world tilt toward the kind of violence he'd promised his son he would avoid. Then Leela moved. She stepped between two men who would have used force like punctuation and pressed a palm to the nearest Hargrove's chest. In one motion, she pulled a small silver case from her jacket and opened it. Inside, a photograph of a small boy with Mateo's cheeky grin. The room blinked. The Hargrove man paled as if a ghost named his own conscience. Leela's voice cut the clamor. "You think I'm expendable," she said. "You think my life is currency in your books. Let him live." She isn't the same heiress men had been taught to expect tonight, Marco thought. The woman who'd come into the closet was a strategist. The woman who stood now was a sacrificial lamb who refused to be sold. Her gamble was raw and unorthodox, privilege used to shield someone with no entitlement to the club's mercy. The gamble worked on instinct. Men who worshipped lineage also adored leverage. A child's face held a universal taboos even forged clubs hesitated to cross. A Hargrove lieutenant barked orders, but the cadence of authority shifted. Where cleanliness had been the plan of men calculating humiliation, Lila had introduced a variable not included in the ledger: human stakes. Reyes took the opening like the leader had been, not in mercy, but in tactical advantage. "We keep it peaceful," he ordered, voice gravelly. He threw a look at Marco that was both warning and permission. "Your son stays out of this. Your courage is back-pocketed currency." Yet the night's true danger wasn't diplomacy. It was the man with the chipped front tooth who'd come with a vendetta. He lunged for Lila, the acid of old grudges pouring from him. Marco saw the movement as if through slow glass. A hand, a lunge, a flash of blade. Instinct made him move forward before calculation. Fatherhood made him act with a force he hadn't known he had. Marco shoved through the crowd like a freight and found himself between the chip-toothed man and Lila. He caught the man's arm, then the blade, then the balance of a moment that could have been the end. The blade nicked Marco's forearm, a shallow line that bled red and felt holy. He tasted metal and realized he'd been holding his breath until then. The man swore and pulled back. Reyes and a few prospects closed the distance and restrained the attacker. The lot's noise dimmed into a haze of curses and commands. Lila's hand was on his wound before anyone could make it a spectacle. Her fingers were warm and precise, the kind of touch that belonged to a woman who'd learned to patch people up without asking permission. "You idiot," she said, and the indignation in her tone was tenderness masked as scorn. "You kept my son safe," he said. Blood warmed his palm. "I will accept the cost if you keep him from being used." Lila's mouth twitched. For a moment, they were not Heiress and Janitor, but two people who thought they had less to give and chose anyway. Reyes stepped forward then, drawing the room's attention back to the matter at hand. "No blood tonight," he ordered, his voice iron. "We will not give them a martyr, and we will not give the Hargroves a reason to burn this town down." His gaze fixed on Lila with a complexity that suggested he recognized her choice and still resented its implication. He turned to Marco. "You keep your boy out of the circle. You keep him somewhere safe. If this escalates, we'll deal with it together." It was an odd promise from a man who traded in debts, but in a world of calculations, odd promises are survival tools. Marco nodded. The wound on his arm throbbed, but the pain grounded him. He thought of Mateo suddenly, of the way the boy's legs had lodged into the crook of his waist at bedtime, of the way he'd asked 3 months ago why heroes always rode away. Marco had always told him that heroes sometimes stayed. In that aching moment, bruised and bleeding, Marco realized staying could be the most dangerous kind of heroism. As the sun rose fully, the Hargrove convoy roared back to life, engines complaining like beasts pulled from sleep. Their emissary approached Reyes for one last exchange. Words like contracts, promises wrapped in thin courtesy. When they left, the lot felt exhausted, as if a boulder had been shifted and both sides counted the space it left behind. Lila walked to Marco and took his hand, fingers cool where his blood dried. "You didn't have to," she began, but the sentence fractured like glass. He pressed his palm to her cheek, where engine oil met perfume, and said, simply, "You saved a child tonight. That's enough." She studied him as if mapping him for future use, not for leverage, but for tenderness. "I may owe my family a lot," she said, "but tonight I repaid something else." Her voice leaned into confession. "There are things I will do to make this right, not because of duty, because of what you did." Marco's laugh was small and brittle. "You don't owe me anything." She shook her head. "You didn't let a little boy become a ledger. That aligns you with something dangerous, conscience." The way she said it made it sound like a promise. "You want something from me?" she asked, surprising him with the directness. "I can give you protection. Not a patch, God knows I can't do that, but protection, visibility. If the Hargroves look to avenge this, I can make it costly." He looked at her, the woman who'd been taught to buy and sell lives, who now offered sanctuary as payment. His arm burned where the blade had nicked him. His body hummed with adrenaline and fear and a strange, hot gratitude. "I don't want your protection if it ends with my son wearing colors," he said. The words were a boundary. He had no intention of letting Mateo step into a road he had sworn to close off. Lila's answer was a vow disguised as irony. "Then I'll promise you something else. I will cut off any favor that endangers Mateo. If my family tries to trade anything that touches your son, I will be the one to make sure it doesn't happen." Her promise was a high-risk currency. Its value lay in what she could influence within a club that thrived on its own ruthlessness. Marco wanted to ask for more, a guarantee that no ledger would ever list his son's name, a patch that would keep them safe. Instead, he leaned his head against hers for a beat, sharing the quiet space between two people who understood the cost of promises. "Deal," he said. It was small enough to carry and large enough to change their night. They walked back to the clubhouse together, side by side, not because the world had rearranged itself to allow it, but because they'd chosen to. As they moved, prospects watched, calculating and curious. Some scowled, some nodded, and Heiress followed at a discreet distance, his jaw a map of unreadable decisions. Marco had bled tonight for a choice that was neither glorious nor neat. He had promised his son's safety, and in making that promise had stitched himself to a woman who could make violence administrative and mercy a contingency. It was an uneven bargain, a dangerous union, and perhaps the only honest one either of them had in years. In the days that followed, the lot's memory would calcify into gossip and then into precedent. Allies would be called and favors tallied. But for now, Marco returned home to a small boy who would hug him and ask for pancakes, and a life that would continue because he had decided to let it. He had stepped into the teeth of men and returned with a wound and a pledge that might, if fortune smiled, bend the world enough to give a child a future not measured in patches and blood. The price had been paid in a cut and in risk. The gift was the chance to keep a boy's life ordinary. That night, in the dim kitchen light, Marco peeled an orange for Mateo and felt the band's pressure of a promise tighten around his chest like a warm hand. He had stayed. He had claimed a line. The trouble was out there, rusted and hungry. But inside his house, for the first time in years, the world felt salvageable. Morning came like a quiet verdict, and Marco woke to Mateo's small humming and the smell of syrup. He watched the boy sleep, saw the gap in his grin, and traced the bruise on his forearm where a blade had kissed him. The night that had rearranged loyalties left a small room of safety around their house, a fragile treaty. Leela kept her word. She called favors, shifted conversations, and pushed Hargrove's hands away from Matteo's name. Marco received a text. I kept mine. He sent back a photo of sliced cardboard crowns and wrote, "He stays." That small exchange was a treaty signed in pixels. The compound learned to read Marco differently. He still scrubbed floors, emptied ashtrays, coaxed men into kindness, but his refusal to let Matteo become a ledger reshaped how Reyes and others saw him. Respect arrived like a wary truce. Hargrove grumbled, recalculated, but Lila used influence to fence danger off. She could not erase history, only reroute consequence. Between them, a new gravity developed. Coffees in the kitchen, quick texts about school plays, hands touched over paperwork, glances in rooms full of men pretending blindness. They talked about color, about what safety really meant, and about the cost of keeping a child ordinary. They argued, soothed, traded small mercies. One afternoon, Lila slid a leather jacket over Marco's shoulders, not as a patch to be worn, but as a weight of promise. He felt it like a warmth placed where grief had lived. They were not pledged, not sewn into a brotherhood, only two people who had chosen one another after a night of risk. The world outside still hummed with ledgers, with men ready to trade lives, but inside their small orbit, a different currency circulated. Promises and morning pancakes, bedtime stories, and the sanctity of a boy's ordinary day. Reyes watched, sometimes with admiration, sometimes with the tactical caution of a man who keeps books. Lila did more than protect. She chose, publicly and quietly, to make sacrifices. She cabled favors, redirected debts, and, when it mattered most, stepped into consequence instead of letting a child become an example. Marco bled, and Lila tended, and the wound became a bond neither had planned. Months later, in a kitchen washed in late light, they sat with Matteo at the table, crumbs like confetti. He carved promise.